assessment inventory. That's the first 3 weeks. Then we shift into negligence if you don't do the right thing. Misfeasance, malfeasance, nonfeasance, we shift into those if you get it wrong. And then we go into discipline after that. So we just did week 4 last night. We just moved into negligence. But we spent the first 3 weeks. What's Maslow's hierarchy? Safety and security has to come first.
Mm-hmm.
School operations, that's the first thing you learn.
Dr. Lamb, everybody's with us. Dr. Revis, Dr. Crawford, Dr. Hamilton, everybody's with us, and I've got it recording for you to begin. When you get to the need assessment process, you may have had a chance to look at. I found a document that I placed.
Yeah, but 2 minutes in, it stops and wants you to sign up.
Oh, okay. But I'm just looking at the word, you know, the description of it, that more than anything else.
Yeah, and so my point is don't sign up.
Don't sign up. Yeah, I'm just putting it there for them to understand better what it is.
Yeah, when you get to that part, you've got enough. And so that was the first thing I was going to pick up on before we looked at what I've got on the screen, which I probably shouldn't have on the screen until just a minute. Dr. Stedman did put you a little video on needs assessment, gap analysis. He sent it out a few minutes ago. One of the things they said in there was closing the gap. What you got to remember, the AAPTEL is what we commonly call in North and South Carolina a closing the gap program. Every school has to have a closing the gap program between the subgroups in their school. And it describes that you know, closing the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And that's what you got to do. That's a closing the gap program. And that's what your most pressing needs. You look at your data. But when you're doing gap analysis, there's a couple of things that you got to think about. And that's the part I want to highlight tonight. And it hits on one of them in that little short video, but it doesn't hit the other. One of them that hits on is cost benefit analysis. And that will lead us to the other one that it doesn't talk about, which is effect size. Cost benefit analysis is how much does it cost versus how much gain I can get and how many students does it touch. One of the problems that you get in with when you deal with smaller groups, smaller subgroups in your school is you spend a whole lot of time, effort, and energy, and you only affect 6 kids, 5 kids. Well, every kid's important. So when you're doing your gap analysis, one of the pitfalls that we get into is we just look for the lowest group. Well, we need to look at the size of that group so that we can have the largest effect size as possible. And that's part of cost benefit analysis. And also, we've got a school of 600. We can move our reading scores 1 point from 68 to 69 with a new reading program. It costs $2 million. Would you be willing to pay $2 million to move your reading scores 1 point from 68 to 69? That cost benefit analysis isn't there. So that's got to be factored into the programs as well that you choose. What you're looking for is at least 1 standard deviation of gain with any program that you pick to try to address in your needs assessment, to try to address your gap. You should look for at least 1 standard deviation of gain. Now, on state tests in North Carolina that are normed at a 100-point scale, that means 5 points. That's the minimum. If it doesn't move, if you can't move your school 5 points, that's 1 standard deviation, then I wouldn't even, no matter how much it costs, I wouldn't be looking. It's not worth the time. So that cost benefit analysis. And see, now don't fall for the banana in the tailpipe gag that a lot of these companies do in terms of, we can move your scores 100 points, but it's on a 1,000,000-point scale. That's why you compare standard deviations. How many standard deviations does it move? All of a sudden, they don't look so good. You know, moving your test scores 100 points on a 1,000,000-point scale is, you know, 1/10 of one standard deviation. That's not too good. And so you've got to understand here, and all of you are add-on licensures, so you've had an assessment course, but you know that you have to convert scores on dissimilar scales using z-scores. Not important to know how you do that. What's important to know, however, is that z-scores rely on standard deviations. They balance dissimilar scales by using the number of standard deviations. And so when you're doing your gap analysis, you got to look for having the largest impact, cost versus benefit. Again, you've got a subgroup with 350 in it, and their scores are 15 points below your school average. And you got a group with 5 in it, and theirs is 20 points below. That's not your most pressing need, that group of 5. Now, you say, well, my kid's in that group, so that makes them, but your most pressing need is that 350 students that are 15 points below your school average. That's your most pressing need. So when you do gap analysis, make sure you do gap times number. Big N, the number in that group, gap times number. When you're doing gap analysis, make sure it's gap times number. And that's one of the reasons why you have to avoid some subgroups, because just low numbers. You're looking for the most impact that you can have to move your overall school. If you've got 350 in a subgroup and a school of 600, if you could move them, that's a whole lot better than moving 5. That might be actually lower than them. I'm not saying ignore them, but we're trying to get the closing the gap is trying to get as big an impact as we can in our school. All right. I'm sure you've got questions, but I'll pause. Anybody have any questions on what you're doing in terms of you form a PLC, you look at your data, you determine, and I'll say you should make some decisions before you actually look at your data in terms of what's most important. And I would look at my school improvement plan. School improvement plan says we want to work on reading, or if your principal says we're interested in reading this year, I would look heavily at reading. I'd make some of those decisions up front. But form your PLC, set your norms, your values, have your meetings, disaggregate your data, look at your subgroups, see look at the size of the subgroup versus the gap between what you want and where you are. And how I'm going to move them up to the school average. And then do cost benefit analysis, how much time, effort, energy, how many people. That comes out in that graphic organizer for your action plan. It asks you specific activity, person responsible, timeline, formative assessment, summative assessment, resources needed.
And
that
we'll go over
resources
all that next week, Dr. Lamb. Tuesday,
Yeah.
we'll get all of that.
So that factors, that's that cost benefit analysis. Oh, this program's free, but how many personnel does it take? How much time does it take from the existing personnel? Do you have to hire new people to do this? What's the big problem with RTI? It's very expensive. Very expensive. It's a great program. Don't get me wrong, but you couldn't afford it as an individual school. Your district has to buy it. It's a wonderful program, but it's not something that you can mount on your own. Reading 3D was the same way. The price excluded them being widely used, other than districts had to buy them, and then eventually the state bought both of them. But that's what we're talking about here. All that factors into your gap analysis. Don't pick a subgroup with 3 or 4 or 5 students in it when you've got something over here that just who scored nearly as bad that's got 300 in it. All right. Other questions you have on gap analysis? All right.
But that information and the other instructors may not have it in their shells yet, but it's just information to give them a better understanding when they look at it. Like Dr. Lamb said, don't sign up.
That little video,
Just read it.
I would have pulled up a lesson plan with this, but he's got that little short video which encapsulates all these thoughts.
Right.
And it's much easier just he's got that. I was going through pulling up my materials when that one came through, and I said, aha, I'll just use that. Y'all can just have that rather than another document from me. All right, so let's talk about EVAAS. When you're doing your gap analysis, when you're looking at your standardized scores, a lot of folks don't use EVAAS. And the reason why they don't is some people don't understand it, some people don't agree with it, and a lot of people don't agree with it because they don't understand it. The biggest issue that teachers have with EVAAS is they always want to know, where does that growth score come from? Who determined what a score an individual child has to make to show a year's growth? We all understand that EVAAS is value added, and what it does is it compares a kid against himself or herself. It's not comparative accountability compared to another person or another group. It takes this kid and it projects, this is the number that this kid, this is the score that he has to make or she has to make on this particular test to show a year's growth. The question always is where'd that number come from? And then everybody says, well, that's proprietary from SAS, SAS out of Research Triangle. They don't tell you that part. They just tell you, well, previous test scores factor into that. Well, teachers have an aversion. They think that they're not being treated fairly, that some kids are easier to get growth than others. I've heard teachers say, oh, it's really hard to get, it's hard to show growth with the top kids. No, it's not. It's not any harder to show. All kids, it's the same. It's just as easy to show growth with all of them because it's that child's individual score is determined. And so that growth score is not just some random score, it's for that child. And so you may not have to move that child as far as another child, but all of that is factored in. It's tailored to each individual child. And so you say, well, Dale, explain it to me. Well, I'll do that. All right, so the idea here is, and before you flood the screen, no, I won't give you this. The overall thought process or the way EVAAS works is that every teacher's students, 85% of them are supposed to make growth. And in a school, 85% of all the teachers are supposed to show growth. So it's an 85-85 model that for your school to meet expected growth, for you as a teacher to make expected growth, 85% of your students in your room have to make growth, have to achieve their growth score. And as a school to show growth that you met growth, 85% of your teachers had to met growth. So that's the way this works. And so how does it start? Well, it started with analysis of variance. So at 20 years, it took 20 years of testing from 1990 to 2010. That's exactly 20 years. It took 20 years of test data, and it was all dumped into a database. And then an analysis of variance was run. Analysis of variance tells us how much variance in a test score is dependent upon dependent variables. And so we understand a linear regression. A linear regression is just all the things that we know. It's a prediction equation. All the dependent variables about a kid lead to their test score. And so in 3, we can see x1 through 10 equals y. That's the number of dependent variables that we have will determine their score on a particular test. And so the question is, what are the 10 variables? That's proprietary information. SAS doesn't release that. And in what ratio or proportion or how much variance do each of them count? Now, the reason I'm not going to give you this because people say, aha, this is racist. No, this is just what the data says. Now, the data may vary a point or two one way, every year, but we've continued over the next 10 years to continue to add these scores to the database. And these are the 10 dependent variables that determine a kid's score. There's no debate on this. These are the 10, and this is the rough percentages that each of them are. Race counts for 30%. Mother's education, 15. Father's income, 15. Teacher, 10. We're trying to isolate. None of these things are up to the school. The only thing that's variable here for the school is the teacher. We're looking to see if the teacher adds value. They can add up to 10% in the variance of a test score. The other 90% is controlled for. School district 5, school 5, grade 5, age 5, gender 5, previous test scores 5%. That's the calculation. So the only dependent variable that can be affected by the school is the teacher. And so that's what we're trying to isolate. How much value does a teacher add in that classroom to the growth of that child? So here's how it would work. All right. Third grade math EOG has 180 questions. So the total raw score that any student could achieve would be 180. The question is, what score out of 180 would represent a year's growth? It's different for every child. You have to work the formula, the actual algorithm. The regression equation is used to determine what that score would be. Total percentage of dependent variables times the total raw score yields the target raw score to show a year's growth. So here's an actual example. Jamar is a third grade student in Charlotte, Mecklenburg. His dependent variables are, he's black, he gets 20 out of 30 points. White would be 30 out of 30, Hispanic would be 15 out of 30. That's not racist, that's just how the scores paired out. That's what historical 30 years of data tells us the relationship between those would be. Mother has less than a high school diploma, he gets 5 out of 15. Beyond a 4-year degree would be 15. College, high school to college would be 10. No father in the home, 0 out of 15. Father's income in excess of 150 would be 15. Does anybody know the relationship between mother's education and father's income? Why those have so much variance in a test score? Who reads to children? That would be their mother. It's called seat time or lap time. And if dad makes enough money, what can mom do?
Stay home.
That would be stay at home. Teacher, 10. CMS, high wealth district, low wealth district would be 2. Billingsville Elementary, 0. That was a takeover school. A high growth school would be 5. He's in his grade, he's not a repeater, so he gets 5. If he'd been a repeater, he'd have got 2. Age, he only gets 3 because he's 9 years old, developmentally delayed, and didn't start school until he's 6, so he's actually a year behind. Gender, 5, because it's a math test. Females, 4. Difference in males and females. It'd be the opposite that we're a reading test. Females score higher than males. Previous test scores, 2. He was not on grade level according to M-class data coming out of 2nd grade. So his equation looks like this. 20 plus 5 plus 0 plus 10 plus 5 plus 0 plus 5 plus 3 plus 5 plus 2 equals 55%. We multiply that by the total, 180 questions times 0.55. He's got to get 99 questions right to show a year's growth. That's the way it works for every child. We have all of that data of those 10 dependent variables at our fingertips. We know that about every child. They have to fill all that information out. We have it all. This is how the regression equation works. The algorithmic part is we adjust the point value according to the amount of variance. That's how it works. So everything, as you can see, the only thing that's a real variable is the teacher. This equation, allows for or controls for everything except the teacher. We can isolate whether that teacher added 10% of variance to that score or not. So we know if the teacher added value or not. So,
Lamb, can you
yeah,
address this real fast? Some of the South Carolina people, they said that they're lost because they've never heard of EVAAS before.
South Carolina uses EVAAS.
That's what I thought.
South Carolina uses EVAAS as well. It's what you call growth in South Carolina, a growth model.
So, but now it may be if you're in the classroom, your administration may not have ever used that terminology with you.
Yeah.
Showed it. So I understand this is a learning experience, and it gives you an opportunity to go back and to ask somebody about it now.
South Carolina is moving into EVAAS.
Yes.
But they already have it. They call it the growth model.
Right.
You know, did you grow your students a year's growth? This is how that's determined. And it's not a growth for your individual class. It's the 85, it's by individual students, and then the 85% of them meet that. There is no group or class score or average. That doesn't work in growth. Growth is individual kids. Did 85% of the kids in your room make growth? And that's dependent upon each individual kid. They all have their own separate and distinct and individual growth number, and it's dependent upon their variables. It's dependent upon their dependent variables. That's why we call them dependent variables.
Dr. Lamb, would I be safe to say that everybody in North Carolina is going to, EVAAS should be a common terminology?
It's everybody. Every principal has an EVAAS portal in North Carolina.
Now in South Carolina, you have to ask you may have to ask, what do we do to determine growth? Growth model, whatever, and then
they use EVAAS.
And yeah, and Kenneth, you asked the right question. That is what you would do there.
Yeah. Yep. South Carolina is just exploring growth. We've come to learn that comparative accountability is simply about who you got, not what you do with them. If you get the right pupil assignment, you could be the worst teacher in the world. You know, my wife taught at an IB school for 15 years. It was a lab school on the campus of Davidson College. Anybody know how good a school Davidson College is? I mean, that's the Harvard of the South. $75,000 a year tuition. 100% of their students go on to graduate or professional school. Their endowment is in the billions. We live across the street from that at Lake Norman. My wife taught at their lab school, their IB lab school, for 15 years. And I told her during the era of comparative accountability, and I told her the most important person in her organization was the custodian. As long as you got the front door open every day, the scores were just going to walk right in. In comparative accountability, it didn't matter what they did with them. They had the highest 240 students out of 140,000 students. They had the best and brightest 240 of those. Mm-hmm. But did you grow them or not? Comparative accountability, I'll take them every day if we're doing comparative. I don't even have to show up sober and clean clothes, and I'll whip you every day with that bunch. I mean, them kids' glasses so thick, they had to make sure that no direct sunlight hit them. They'd burn the paper. I mean, those kids, that's the smartest bunch I've ever seen. They'd just embarrass you. You have to worry about their scores. But what we need to be able to determine is, do teachers add value, or is it just their pupil assignment?
Can Marcy ask you a question, because it relates? She's asked, could she ask a question, and it relates to what you're talking about now. Can she come on and ask a question? Marcy, unmute yourself and ask the question. Marcy, unmute.
She's still muted.
You're still muted. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay, so my question is, when I taught 4th grade math and social studies, I had really high scores. My students in 4th grade were almost into the blue, so I received the state bonus and a school bonus. So the administration at the time, the following year, which was last year, they continued me in math, but instead of social studies, they wanted me to teach science, since they're tested for the first time in science in 5th grade. So same set of students that did so high in math, they did high in math again last year, but they didn't meet growth in science. But that was the first time they were ever tested in science. So the scores were high, but the growth wasn't met. So I'll be honest, so it hurt my little feelings when I saw this red with those really high students. So, and that's actually my highest need, because we feel, I won't go into my whole paper, but we feel that the 5th grade science teacher, which happens to be me this year, needs help from K to 4 to start building that foundation for science.
There you go. Because
but I just want to know, because I want to cry that I didn't meet growth for science, but I just want to know, I guess, is part of it based on those high math scores in 4th grade?
No, it doesn't have anything to do with that. It has to do with you being the first time tested, knowing what's going to be tested.
Okay. So even though the scores were high, they didn't meet growth data.
Yeah, but it's not because they were high that they didn't make growth. You didn't move them any. They came in smart, they left smart, but you didn't move them. And that's a function of first time test. And you figuring out.
But what is how do they project how they will move if it's the first time they're tested in science?
By the dependent variables. They don't have to have anything for the first time. They've got all they need for the dependent variables.
Those 10 things that Dr. Lamb talked about.
That don't have anything to do with science or I mean, we know the 10 variables about them. Everything is controlled for.
So using that those variables that you just went over, so basically that shows that the 5th grade science teacher does need support to be able to move those kids, because if they come in and it's just the 5th grade teacher, okay, that's what I thought.
Now
Thank you.
Here's the corollary, and I'm going to open it up for Jamal, Dr. Crawford, because this is his bailiwick. Here's the sad news for you, Marcy. You may get great math scores every year and show growth. You may teach science to you as old as me and never get growth. They don't translate. The principal has a portal that tells us that stuff. And I'm going to let Dr. Crawford pick it up from there.
Yeah,
so, all right, thank you.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that we oftentimes struggle with, because there are just so many things that are already controlled for, that even the window for us to effect that growth is sometimes difficult to address. So we know what a student's expected scores are. Now, the downside to that is we don't get them until November. Even this year got them in December. So first of all, we're now dealing with even a small window with which even to be able to address and use those, but by then you're halfway into the school year, and it's difficult to know exactly how to or what levers to push to be able to affect some of those kids, especially when you are looking at kids that are coming in with expected percentile scores that are starting in the single digits. So that's one of the uphill climbs that you have to figure out how to deal with. So not only are you looking at a year's worth of growth, but for many kids, you're looking at trying to get growth over time to get that kid on a path to success down the road.
So was the 10%, so does that mean that I was considered a 10% value to those students because I taught them?
No. Like I said, Dr. Lynn was correct. One has nothing to do with the other.
Nothing to do with
the the teacher 10%, how is that determined? What exactly does that mean?
That's how much analysis of variance tells us that a good teacher would add to students. That's what the data tells us.
So for example, if you go back and look at those students' scores and look at what their predicted score was, you could have had a kid that had a predicted score of, say, 85%. Now, if that kid scored in the in the say 72nd percentile on the science test. The good news is that's going to be a level 4 kid. So that's going to be a kid that passed your EOG. Problem is he missed his projected score by about 13 percentage points. And so if you start looking at that kid by kid by kid, then you mentioned red. So what that tells me is a lot of you kids simply missed what their target is, and whatever their target was, whether if it's a kid that was supposed to score in the 10th percentile that only got to the 5th, or whether it was a kid that was supposed to score in the 80th percentile and only scored in the 70th. Now, I say only scored in the 70th percentile, but again, if you're looking at growth, you see 70%. Again, that's going to be a level 4 kid for you. So
that's
yes,
comparative accountability.
Right, but then he absolutely killed you in your growth score because he missed his target by 10 points.
Again, comparative accountability is about who you get. If you get the upper end kids, they're going to score high. But did you move them? Did you grow them?
Right.
Or warehouse them for a year? I mean, smarter kids come in the door, they're going to score high. But did you grow them? Now, that 10% is what a good does. It varies from 9 to 11, but 10% of the variance in it. Now, here's the thing. If you don't add at least 7, they won't make growth. If you don't add at least 7, they won't make growth. If you don't add at least 7% of the variance in their test scores, they won't make growth.
So I guess I'm having a hard time understanding and looking at some of the other questions. I'm wondering, how does that teacher, so the 10% of the teacher value, the X4 on the screen, was I added to the, okay, based on my previous
they predict
scores?
every teacher at 10%. Has nothing to do with you. That kid's every teacher is projected at 10. And if they don't make their score, it's because the teacher didn't add 10. Everything else is controlled for. The only thing that's variable in this equation is the teacher. Their score is based on averaging a 10 for the teacher. There's a plus or minus 2%, that's what I said, or 1.5, which means if you don't add at least 7, you don't have to add the full 10. But if you don't add 7%, then the kid won't make growth. But the
I understand. Okay.
Independent of the teacher.
I thought that 10% went up or down, but it stays. It's the teacher is at 10%. Period.
10%.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Anybody.
Dr. Lamb, may I say this?
Okay.
I know most of you are sitting there because you're still in the classroom and you're thinking teacher, and you need to understand this as a teacher. But now our focus should be, you're in the classroom now, but you've got to begin thinking from the administrator's role, the role of an administrator as they are looking at all of this.
Who gets growth and who doesn't? Who teaches what? What kind of kids do you get the best growth with?
Right, and that one
we're going to plug that in next semester.
Yeah, and that one variable that you do have some control over, the teacher, and we're going to be dealing with that in evidence number 2 when you deal with the AAPTEL, because there's an action plan, for teacher leadership and empowerment. This will lead into all of that. So we want your thought processing to be, you need to understand it because you're in the classroom interview, but you think as an administrator as you're looking at all of this. And that's how Dr. Lamb is presenting it from the administrator's perspective of things.
See, here's the next part of this is you're going to do a growth plan for your teachers. Here's mine. I call mine MTSS for teachers. I'm not very creative. You're going to develop a growth plan. Now, we're going to pick up with this in OMA Task 2 next semester. That's where we're going to pick up in OMA Task 2 with your growth plan. You're just going to do a copy and paste of your first 3 tasks of the AAPTEL, and then we're going to start from that, and we're going to start building a master schedule. But what you got to learn is certain teachers do. I mean, I want Marcy teaching kids in math because she gets growth. The jury's still out. I'm going to have her teaching science or not.
Dr. Lamb?
I got to make those decisions.
I know, but see,
pay me for as administrator.
and that's exactly my issue this week. I've been looking at the science score as, I mean, I feel I'm a good teacher because of the math, but I feel like, okay, if I was an admin, would I feel that this teacher can teach the math? Clearly that's the case, but does this mean because I didn't make growth in science, even though it's the first time, does that mean that I'm not a good science teacher? That's what I'm trying to determine as an admin.
We'll know after next year. We'll know.
Right. So,
See,
Dr. Lamb.
here's what I would do. I'd put a plan like this in to help you grow. And then if you still didn't grow, then it's time for a new ops. Yes.
So a couple of things to remember, folks. One, when you're looking at a teacher's EVAAS data, you typically get 3 years worth of data before you get your multi-year trend, and that's really your baseline. So that's one thing to remember. The second thing is using this in a real-world fashion. Just this week, looking at 2 first-grade teachers, I was able to break down their EVAAS data for the year by subgroup, and it turns out one teacher does extremely well with kids that are struggling, and the other teacher does extremely well with kids that are the high flyers. So from a standpoint of what to do with that during the school day, it's a very easy fix to adjust the schedule so that those teachers can work off each other's kids.
Now, here's where it starts to get tricky. Let's say we can continue to use Marcy as the example here tonight. Marcy is a really good math teacher, and the upper kids, she grows the upper kids. She had the same kids for science. She did not grow them. But what happens if we find out that Marcy she can grow the lower kids in science, but the upper kids in math? Well, I tell you, that starts making scheduling a nightmare. Because then we got to move kids an extra time, or we got to regroup or reshuffle. One of the things that the data tells us is that teachers aren't as effective across all content areas and across all ability levels. That you might be good with the high math, but the low science, or vice versa. That it's not just, if you're a great math teacher of the upper kids, you'll be a great science teacher of the upper kids. Unfortunately, it does not work that way. If it does, hooray. But that's what EVAAS tells us. And so when we're master scheduling, what teachers teach what classes where and when, who puts the stickies on the board where. All principals claim, well, we schedule using EVAAS. No, you don't. You've got a whiteboard head that's gridded off, and you put them little yellow stickies on it. I know you, because that's what I did. But the question is, whose name do you put on the stickies and where? And see, that's what they pay you for as an administrator. So we can't look at this from a teacher perspective. From an administrative perspective, we got to know this person grows this group of kids in this subject area the best, and this group in this subject area the best. And we've got to plug the people in. But we've got to have, just like with Marcy, Marcy's obviously a great teacher because she gets, she gets growth in math from the high kids. And so what we would do is we would build a professional growth plan for Marcy and everybody on staff, where we work with her to improve her in that area. That's our responsibility as administrators. What's your number one responsibility to people that you hire? To make them successful. Long gone are the days where you hire somebody, a good teacher, and send them down the room and they close the door and you don't ever see them, except maybe at lunch or at recess. That's not the way it works. Your job is to grow them into great teachers. They don't all show up being great. Believe it or not, not everybody that walks in your building looking for a job is the very best. Believe it or not, everybody that works in your building is not the very best. And you know what? For years, we judged teachers on the kids that they had, the assignment. And guess what? Guess what EVAAS has told us? Some of those teachers weren't very good at all. They just had great kids. It was about pupil assignment. This is about whether you can teach or not. This is about whether you can teach or not just, you know, are you popular with, you know, do you have the best kids in the district? And what we find is this is where the rubber meets the road. This is a real deal. This is whether you can teach or not. Because this tells us how much value you add.
And
Comparative
Dr. Lamb,
accountability is about who you got. Growth accountability is about what you do with who you got.
and this is where, you know, this is not easy stuff. This is where, when you know that the teacher's not doing what they're, this is where, as an administrator, you have to have hard conversations with people. They're not going to like you sometime. Am I right, Dr. Crawford? They're not going to like you sometime with the conversations that you have. Dr. Hamilton, wouldn't you agree?
Well, yes, Dr. Stedman, I do agree. Can I just throw one little thing in?
Go ahead, yes.
I went to an EVAAS training that SAS did a couple of weeks ago, and they had us do an activity where it was basically a table, and they gave us they fictitious teachers and their EVAAS scores by subgroups. And I mean like low performing students, middle performing students, and high performing students. That's what I mean when I'm saying subgroups. And they had us color code the teacher, the fictitious teacher, by low, middle, high, like if they did not meet growth, if they met growth, or if they exceeded growth. So we did the red, green, blue. So then the conversation that they had us work through was they gave us students. So this is a low performing student, a middle performing student. So this is a middle performing student, and when they were in kindergarten, their teacher was red with the middle children. And then when they were in first grade, that teacher was red with the middle children. So when you're going to second grade with this child, and it's a middle performing child, and they have already had 2 consecutive years of teachers who do not get good growth out of the middle performing children, then as an administrator, they were telling us, you need to be very mindful to try to put those children with somebody who can grow the middle child high. Historically, they've had good success with that level of child because they've had 2 years of teachers who are not successful with what they bring to the table. And so we owe it to the children to look at that and to make a determination about what is the best teacher placement for them. And that doesn't mean where is their best friend going to be in the room so they can be in the room with their friend, but how that teacher can affect that child's learning.
And you may go into a school and, you know, you may become principal of a school, and this teacher may have been in second grade for 100 years and think, I own second grade, I own this classroom. But you may have to decide, you know, you're not doing anything for my second grade students, so I'm going to put you in first grade. Or, you know, you have to make some hard decisions. They will not like you when you make these decisions initially, but
and they'll stick the parents on you too, by the way.
They will, but I promise you that over time, most of them will begin to understand why you did what you did, and many times they'll thank you for making the move because they grow in ways that they've never grown before. They can say, well, I've been a second grade teacher for 15 years. Guess what? They've taught second grade for 15 years, but they've taught just one time for 15 years because they've done the same thing for 15 years and there have been no changes. So you've got to go in and you've got to be able to identify these weaknesses in your school. If you don't, then everything that Dr. Lamb's talked about, there won't ever be any differences.
And Marcy, don't beat yourself up too badly. As Dr. Crawford mentioned a few minutes ago, after 3 years of testing in the same subject area, you get that multi-year trend. And that is not a simple average. That is taking all 3 years and treating it as if it's 1 year. So you've got more data points there, which makes it more valid and more reliable. And that's the purpose for giving that multi-year trend. I've had teachers, let's say, that are green for 3 years, but their multi-year data is blue because it's more valid and reliable results because of the number in the sample population. So, so you'll see that as you go through, and that'll be important in 3 years to be able to look at.
But Marcy, those were excellent questions that you posed.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, but now Dr. Stedman's talking about the political side of this. And that's where you got to know your numbers. You got to know who gets what growth. And that's what Dr. Hamilton went to a workshop. The SAS teaches you how to do this. You've got to plug the right kids with the right teacher according to the data. And that's the secret to building effective master schedules in a school. Master schedules are built on a hierarchy. There's what we call the rationale. You have to start with your federal programs, federal law. That's why we had you go over and cover all of those. So federal law comes first, then state law, then local board policy, then EVAAS, and then teacher input. Teacher input comes last, not first. It doesn't matter who's friends or whatever. Now, teachers might not like that. They might sick parents on you. In 1990, when we started school accountability in North Carolina, I was a principal. It then was called Performance-Based Accountability Program. It became the state ABCs, but it was called PBAP at the time.
I was right there with you.
And so the first thing that we were required to do in the county that I taught in was to stop doing the bluebirds, robins, and buzzards.
Exactly.
You quit doing ability grouping. You had to do heterogeneous grouping. Well, you're talking about the maddest people in the community were the teachers, because the ones that had been there the longest got the bluebirds. And then the second longest, the robins, and the new ones always got the buzzards. That's the way it worked. And so they stick the parents on you. So the first parent call I got was, why's my kid in the dumb class? Your kid's not in the dumb class. They've been balanced. It's heterogeneous. Well, I don't believe that. It said Jimmy's in that class, and everybody knows he's an idiot. And so that's how it all kicked off. And it went downhill from there. That's absolutely a true story. And so this is not about your social standing as a teacher. This is not about how long you've been there. As Dr. Stedman said, some people have 15 years of experience. Some have 1 year of experience 15 times.
Right.
This is about people who get it done. This is about people who can actually move kids, can grow kids. This is what school is all about. This is not about warehousing. This is about making sure that you have matched the right kinds of kids with teachers that get the best results with those kinds of kids. And if you don't have them, you got to grow them into that. And that's what your professional development model is about. We're having trouble as a school with this kind of kid. We got to work on working with that kind of kid. And that's not a pejorative, that kind of kid. It's just this is a low, middle, or a high kid. We got to find people, and it's not about time. It's about talent. I inherited a football coach, wasn't much of a football coach, and he certainly wasn't much of a history teacher. He taught European AP. At that time, Charlotte Mecklenburg, I was high school principal, was paying for all AP exams. I think we'd been testing for about 5 years at that point. He'd had exactly 0 students pass the AP exam with 3 or higher. Exactly 0 in 5 years. At mid-year, I put a brand new teacher that I'd hired that was just sharp as a tack. I put her in there. She come to me and said, "Oh, I don't know." Said, "It's just, it's not my turn." I told her, "It's not about turn, not about time you've been here. It's about talent." I said, if you just show up, you'd be better than what I've got so far. He might be absolutely the worst teacher I've ever seen. To call him a teacher would be a stretch. It's insult to every teacher I've ever been around. He is the worst I've ever seen. And then we went from there. But I had to establish that it wasn't that your name's on the door, not on the deed. I don't care how long you've been here. This is about doing the right thing for students. That's what building a master schedule is about. And if you got a bad master schedule, that means you started with a bad process. Yeah, he was coaching football all day. He didn't even go in his room to teach the kids. They just sat there and talked politely among themselves. He was always back in the coach's office, running film or something, sleeping, eating sardines, doing something. I don't know. You could imagine his tenure wasn't very long with me as a football coach or as an employee in general. I helped him into another career. But that's what you have to do. As soon as I walked in as principal, when you go to a new school, and all the people sitting here tonight have done it, when you go to a new school, you have what's called the book. These are things that have been going on that has to stop today, and you have to be the bad guy. And he was one of them. They came in and said, European history has the highest pass rate of any academic AP class. Your fellow has been teaching for 5 years. He's had exactly 0 students pass. And we're paying. He's going. What are you going to do? So I went down to his class to watch him teach. He didn't show up first period. So I put him on bus duty with me so I'd know if he got there every morning or not. He was on car duty in front of the building with me. He didn't show up. I'd dock you pay. You don't get paid for today. And so at mid-year, good thing we're on 4x4, I was able to move him out at mid-year and put somebody in who could actually teach or attempted to teach. And that's what we're talking about. You have objective data as the administrator who can teach and who can't. And you've got to plug in the right people in the right areas. It can't be a political model of a master schedule that this coach always gets these kids, or this teacher always gets those, or this teacher has planning here or there, last period and this not. No. We design kids run by adults for students, for their achievement. I told you the first night that I met with you on January 13th, if you're one of those people that doesn't believe that standardized test scores matter, get out now. That's what it's all about, is moving kids. Performance. That's what school's for. What they do at Jones Sausage, they make sausage. What do we do in public school? We teach kids. It's about performance. It's about moving kids. This is the only way out for a lot of these kids. This is their only shot. 99.9999% of them are not going to be professional athletes. And this is a lot of kids. This is their only way out. This is their ticket to a better life. But they've got to have a good teacher in the classroom. And we just can't say, well, they're highly qualified. Well, I hate that term. Highly qualified teacher. Well, based on what? Certainly not performance. EVAAS is about performance. It's about value added. The calculation is immaterial. What you need to know and what you need to understand is that certain teachers get better results with certain kids than others. That there's no need to sit and argue about what their gross score is or isn't. It's based on them, and it's always isolates everything except the teacher. That's all you need to know. If the kid makes it, it's because of the teacher. If the kid didn't make it, it's because of the teacher, one way or the other. And if they don't, then in that 3-year period of time, you've got to get some support. You've got to build a growth plan to move that teacher toward, you got to get some support toward moving them where they need to be. That's your job. Make people that you hire or that you take over, and when you become principal, make them successful. But we have to get out of this notion that pupil assignment is, if I go to a good school, I'll have it made. Do you move kids or don't you move kids? Not only as a teacher, but as a principal. Are you able to move kids? Are you able to grow them, or are you just warehousing them, keeping them off the street, out of the workforce? There we go.
Now, Dr. Lamb, now everything that you've talked about, it relates to the identified problem that you've already identified, the direction you're going in with your action plan. We'll talk about that next week. Everything in the AAPTEL, but the focus of today is really going to help you when we move into the AAPTEL. We want you to revisit everything that has been said today, and this will be archived under week 4, because you will revisit. And the reason that we like to talk about it now is because we've got you thinking, and that's what we want you to do. You've got to think about this, and we want you to think well about it before you get to that point, because you've got to really push hard to come up with a staff development plan that is going to help. That identified problem is going to make teachers better than what they are. To improve the overall atmosphere, efficacy of your school. And you're going to be writing about and researching about teacher efficacy. What those things that as an administrator you've got to do. You've got several balls in the air all the time, and you're constantly having to balance things all the time. And so that's the whole purpose of tonight, is to make you aware that it's not just about that classroom. That part is easy because you've been dealing with that as a classroom teacher. Now you're beginning to see through those lenses all those other things that come umbrellaed under your role as an administrator. Okay. That's all I got to say, Dr. Lamb.
I don't know anything else. That's all I know.
Anything from
I'm
Dr.
done.
Revis, Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Crawford?
No, I just put in a note. If anyone gets the opportunity, carve out some time. There's a great NPR episode called Zip Code Destiny,
Mm-hmm.
The Persistent Power of Place in Education. It is one of the best I've ever heard. And I think if you carve out some time to listen to it, it'll put a lot of the topics that you'll deal with over the next semester or two into a very, very different context. And give you an understanding of what you are or get ready to walk into.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To add one thing, and that is piggyback on something that Dr. Lamb said about your job is to grow teachers. That's one of the most important jobs you have, is to make sure that every teacher in your building is as strong and highly effective as your highest performing teachers. Because every child deserves a highly effective teacher, every child. And that's what professional development, where that comes in, and coaching your teachers and working with them, setting up mentors for teachers. It's about building teacher capacity so that every child walk into the classroom, regardless of classroom teachers, and be taught by a highly effective teacher. But that's a tough road as an administrator.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you've been a good group. I've watched your faces and just think you've really taken a lot of this in tonight, and I can tell you're really thinking about things. And again, that was our whole purpose, is to challenge you to begin thinking differently. We will see you on Tuesday night. You'll get this video later on tonight. I will upload it and process it and get it out to your instructors, and they'll get it out to you later on tonight. Okay, good night, everybody.
All righty. Good night.
Good night.